This week in Billionaires, fashion legend Giorgio Armani passed away on September 4th at the age of 91. During his remarkable life, Armani not only built a global luxury empire, but also redefined style for generations. He leaves behind an estimated $12.1 billion fortune and a fascinating question mark over who will inherit it. Dan Gilbert, founder of Rocket Mortgage and owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and his soon-to-be ex-wife, Jennifer Gilbert, a renowned interior designer and entrepreneur, recently announced the end of their 30-year marriage on September 5th. But a strategic corporate restructuring, finalized by Gilbert's Rocket companies just months prior, has propelled Jennifer into billionaire status, with an estimated $6.4 billion net worth, thanks to her 15% stake in the publicly traded firm. Sam Altman, the visionary co-founder and CEO of OpenAI, recently listed his secluded Hawaii mega estate for $49 million. This high-profile sale comes as OpenAI gears up for a sale that could make many of its employees very rich, and leaves many curious about the true nature of Altman's personal wealth and what this significant transaction might signal for his future endeavors. Welcome to Beyond the Billions, a show where we dig into the fortunes and finances of the world's wealthiest people. I'm Giacomo Tognini, a staff writer at Forbes, and joining me today is Dan Alexander, a senior editor at Forbes, who's been covering Donald Trump for about 9 years. Dan, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I'm sure readers will be really interested to know how it's been to cover the president for such a long time, and especially during such a tumultuous year so far. Are you tired yet?
Trump is dynamic enough. In some ways, he's super static, but in his business interests, which is what I focus on, he's dynamic. He's just in the last year pushed into cryptocurrency. In his first term, there was so much time spent just sort of getting your hands and heads around what is this business and what are the metrics that we can use to measure it and how can we improve the reporting. And now he's in a totally new industry. In between, he got into social media. So there's
Right.
enough to keep it fresh, keep it exciting, even though, it has been a lot of time focused on one guy.
Yeah, I remember when I first joined Forbes about 6 years ago, I met you and Chase, who's an editor on the wealth team and was covering Trump with you, in the elevator, and you guys both just looked exhausted. So I guess maybe now you've gotten more used to it over time.
There,
I mean,
there are,
how?
and I've gotten
Yeah,
used to the cycles. You get exhausted and then you recover and then you get exhausted again. But overall, in this business, when you have a story that people care about and something that's changing, something that's interesting, something that you can really dig into and that there are a lot of complications to it, that's where you want to be.
right. And you published this great story this week, looking at how the president has gotten so much wealthier over the past year, the wealthiest he's ever been on the Forbes 400 list of the richest Americans. Can you break that down for us? Sort of what are the biggest changes? You obviously mentioned crypto, but if you can just sort of run through what the biggest changes are in his net worth going up so much.
Yeah, sure. So we estimate right now that he's worth about $7.3 billion. That's up $3 billion from last year when he was at 4.3. If you break that gain down, about two of the $3 billion are from his various crypto ventures. So he has two principal ones. He has the meme coin, which he launched right around the time of the inauguration. And then he has World Liberty Financial, which is this sort of amorphous project that he keeps adding new things to. He launches a coin publicly. He has a stable coin that he's using. There are different ways that he makes money through that venture. But if you look at that 2 billion, about half of it roughly is the meme coin, half of it roughly is World Liberty Financial and its various projects. That still leaves $1 billion left over. There was an appeals court in New York that threw out a $500 million fraud ruling against him. That boosted his net worth by $500 million. And then also at the time that he was coming into power, both last year and then now that he's in office, he has vastly expanded his international licensing business, and to the point where it's gone up by about 600% from 2023 to 2024 when he ran for office. And they're continuing to do new deals now. That expansion in revenue has therefore also expanded the value of the business when a multiple is applied to it. And so that's about another $400 million. So those are really the three main components: the licensing, the fraud ruling, and the crypto.
It's fascinating. Let's dig into the crypto side a bit more, since that's sort of the lion's share of what he has grown his net worth in. I remember during the campaign last year, he spoke at a crypto conference, and now obviously back in office, legislation around that has been changing. How has his growing wealth in crypto sort of intersected with what his administration has been doing in terms of crypto legislation, which, from what I understand, has changed a lot since the Biden administration?
Yeah, there are really a couple of different ways to look at this. The first is that the question of, would this have been possible if he weren't president, or if he weren't elected, is kind of easy to answer because he launched World Liberty Financial, the first major crypto project. He announced it about September of 2024. So this is like 2 months before the election. And
Right.
it really didn't do anything. Nobody took much notice. They were trying to sell all these coins. They sold about 15 million of them. But in order for him to make any money, they had to clear a $30 million threshold. So he hadn't earned a cent from the project. And then he got elected. And that's when things changed. So suddenly now you have people in the crypto space who, for a long time, have been facing scrutiny from federal regulators saying, wait a second, we can now do business directly with the guy who's going to control our fate. And so most prominently, Justin Sun comes in and invests $75 million. And he had been charged by Biden's administration with fraud. And that case was still pending at the time. So it's not difficult to connect the dots and see, that he might have been imagining sort of a creative return on that investment. And then you have other people who similarly buy in, and it sort of builds momentum. And as it's building momentum, and Trump is saying, I'm going to change the regulatory landscape, then the value of crypto holdings en masse just shoot way up. And so Trump, as suddenly a large player in the space, benefits from that sort of perception that his administration is going to be much, much lighter on crypto. Then, right at the time of the inauguration, he launches the meme coin. Again, this is something that is explicitly saying we're not an investment, but people are just excited about it and they want to, do some Trump things. They go out and buy a bunch of coins. Trump hangs on to a bunch himself. He collects fees as they're trading. Then, once he's in office, he does, in fact, direct the SEC to take a much more favorable stance toward crypto. And many of those cases that they had been pursuing are paused, thrown out, dismissed, whatever. Simultaneously, he appoints crypto people into his administration to sort of foster crypto innovation. So you've got a real tone change. And then you have concrete things like when they passed the Genius Act, which is
Hmm.
meant to sort of lay out a framework for stablecoins, of which Trump had just launched one of his own. And so you've got all of these things acting in concert and sort of ascribing, percentages of the 2 billion to which of those things it is difficult. But it's clear that it's all sort of one concerted thing where had he not won the election, none of that 2 billion would have happened.
And it's interesting how it's the meme coins, it's the stable coin, it's Royal Liberty, it's sort of various different parts of the crypto landscape, right? And I remember when he was out of office, the sort of part of his business empire that was generating the most news and also boosting his net worth was the Truth Social and sort of the company that he then took public. I understand that's sort of now taken on more of a crypto. It's
Yeah,
more of a crypto business now,
that's
right? If you could talk a bit
it's
more
a,
about
it's a
that,
crypto
yeah.
company. Yeah, so True Social's parent company, the Trump Media and Technology Group, launched with sort of big ambitions to do all sorts of things.
Hmm.
Television, streaming, software hosting, web hosting, all this different stuff, but really didn't get around to much of it other than creating True Social. The problem with True Social is it is a bad business. It
Hmm.
costs a lot of money to run. It's not big enough to generate profit, so it's just lost tons and tons of money year after year. And once Trump won the presidency, then there was sort of hope. Okay, maybe this isn't going to die, but there still wasn't really a whole lot of prospects for growth. I mean, the revenue of the company declined in 2024 as Trump was like the most obsessed about person on earth. So it was clear that social media was not going to turn it into a real profitable operating business, even though investors in the public markets had valued it at a very big number. And so, yeah, as the Trump family gets into all this other crypto stuff, they also steer that business toward crypto and decide that, like a lot of other companies that are trading publicly, they want to become a crypto treasury company. So they're going to buy up a ton of Bitcoin and they're going to hold it on their balance sheet. This is sort of following in the mold of Michael Saylor and
Hmm.
MicroStrategy, and hope that a bunch of people want to trade it and that continually boosts the price. So far, it hasn't necessarily boosted the price a ton, but the company still is trading at a very, very high valuation, giving Trump a personal stake of about $2 billion. It remains to be seen whether that can hang on for the long term or whether eventually sort of this Bitcoin treasury strategy is going to fall by the wayside and they're going to need to come up with something else to gin up excitement again.
Right, they're just sort of one of many companies doing that strategy at this point, right,
Yeah,
in that
that's
space.
exactly right. Including they actually have another company that's doing that same strategy. Just as of about a month ago, they sort of took over a healthcare business called Alt 5 and raised a bunch of money through that venture. And then they are doing a crypto treasury strategy, but instead of buying up Bitcoin, they're buying up tokens of World Liberty Financial, which incidentally when somebody purchases tokens of World Liberty Financial, a lot of that money goes to the Trump family. So you have a public company that they take over, they use a big pile of money that company raises to buy an asset, which sends off huge amount of money to the family. So it's a real sort of masterclass in self-dealing that has generated hundreds of millions of dollars for the family.
Oh. And the Witkoff family also has a stake in World Liberty, right? The family of
That's
Steve
exactly
Witkoff,
right.
the special envoy.
Yeah. Yeah, so at the outset, when this was divvied up, the Trump family took 75% of World Liberty Financial. Donald Trump, the president, took 70% of that. 30% of that was for other family members. We presume that that's Eric, Don Jr., and Barron, who are all listed as co-founders on the project. And then the sort of operators behind it, these two entrepreneurs who really started the thing, they took 12.5%. And then Steve Witkoff and his sons, who are also very involved, or his
Hmm.
kids, I should say, are also very involved in the business. They took another 12.5%. So it's been a huge financial boon, not just for the president, but for one of his top advisors and his family.
Right. And then looking at his real estate business, one of the biggest changes, as you mentioned earlier, was the huge growth in his licensing business, especially overseas. And I remember in the first administration, they had made this pledge about not doing any foreign deals. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that they kind of did stop doing them in the first administration largely. But now that has completely changed, right? He's been doing them in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, most recently Vietnam. Can you tell us a bit more about that, sort of this growth, into context a little bit, looking at the last few years for the Trump organization?
Yeah, so, the Trump family and Donald Trump, had a difficult time getting financing a handful of years ago.
Hmm.
And, then he sort of made a couple of moves to gin up a lot of cash without taking on a lot of debt. One of them was The Apprentice, which was enormously successful. And over the years, probably brought in about $400 million of cash for him. The
Right.
other was to expand the international licensing business. And the people who were really doing a lot of the dirty work for that were his three kids, Ivanka, Eric, and Don Jr. And they were traveling all over the world trying to sell deals. And they talked to lots of different people and all sorts of different prospects, some of which panned out, many of which didn't. But it was sort of an entrepreneurial venture for the family and for the kids. Now, in 2015, when Trump announces that he's running for president, they continue doing that, famously going after deals in Russia during that
Hmm.
time, as well as other countries. But then once he takes office, Trump makes this pledge that he's going to do no new foreign deals. Now, he didn't actually keep the pledge. They did do some foreign deals. He sold some land in the Dominican Republic, for instance, and he continued doing the deals that he already had. Like there was a project in India that was sort of halfway off the ground that they continued working on during his first term. But what they didn't do is sign a bunch of new agreements that they hadn't had any relationship with before he became president. And that did really hamper the business. All of a sudden, sort of the prospects for growth were totally stunted. And after Trump loses the election, there weren't a lot of people who were rushing to get back in business with him. Remember, this is after January 6th. His name is
Hmm.
Sully. And so they're trying to do more business, but can't really figure out who to do it with. There was one entity in Oman that agreed to do a deal with him during that period, but that was pretty much it. And then his presidential campaign, which of course a lot of people counted out, the second one counted out at the outset, became more and more clear that it, had a real chance of success. And as his political momentum was building, then suddenly you see a lot of foreign developers, including ones with connections to foreign governments,
Hmm.
saying, wait a second, why don't we do deals with Trump? And so you see a lot of business in the Middle East. You also see a lot of business in India, and some elsewhere, as you mentioned, in Vietnam. There's a new deal in Romania, and those things are continuing to grow. They're continuing into 2025. We're seeing evidence of new deals that haven't yet been announced, but based on different filings that we've looked at, it looks like they're right on the cusp of announcing them. And so there's no indication that that's going to slow down. Certainly in the early years of his presidency, but even in the later years of this second term, you would expect them just to continue to sign more and more deals, and in doing so, to bring a lot more cash back into their coffers.
And a lot of them have been in the Middle East, right? Like I remember we were looking at Dar Al Arkan, this Saudi publicly traded developer. They're doing a lot of deals with them. And then you
Yes.
mentioned Romania. And then in Serbia, there's the hotel project that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's private equity firm Affinity Partners is in. Do you see, I guess, how do you see this sort of impacting the impression that it gives? First term, they said, we're not going to do any more foreign deals this time. Not only are they doing them, but it's sort of in regions that are strategic for the U.S. and, with big local players in many cases.
I think the people generally at this point, understand what the Trumps are doing. Eric Trump in the transition said that they would follow basically the same plan that they did during the first term, and they clearly are not.
Hmm.
And I think between all of the expansion into new international markets and also the expansion into the crypto industry, I think people, generally understand that they, are using, this moment and their power to expand the business. Now, I don't, from a political analysis standpoint, I don't know that that changes a lot of votes. And I don't know that Trump necessarily cares much about that. I mean, I think that he's come to the conclusion that he can do this without significant political repercussions, and it's going to benefit him. It's going to benefit his family, and I think you can expect billions more dollars to come rolling in.
And how has that resurgence in licensing value affected his fortune? You mentioned it earlier, but sort of how did you go about valuing that and the impact it has on his net worth now?
Yeah, so Trump files financial disclosure reports that give different levels of specificity into different types of businesses that he has. But into the international licensing business, gives you a pretty rough idea that they were generating about $6 million of revenue. And this is a licensing business, so there aren't significant expenses against it. That's almost pure profit in sort of the early years. Then the Oman deal comes in, that adds maybe a little over $5 million in addition. But then in 2024, it looks like their revenue is up to about $45 million. Based on
Wow.
the number of deals that I've seen since then, I would anticipate that in 2025, their numbers will look similar, perhaps even a little bit better than they did in 2024. And then, because you apply a multiple to these things when you're valuing it as a
Hmm.
business, what would somebody else pay to have the right to expand the Trump name all over the world? Well, they would pay a lot more than $45 million because they would expect to
Right.
get that money over several years. And so the value of the business went from roughly $100 million before this latest surge to now about a $500 million.
Fascinating. And before stepping back a little and asking you a bit more about your experience and how you go about this reporting, I think another thing that was interesting in your article was how his debt situation has improved, right? So aside from the court judgment that came in that helped him out, he's been able to sort of reduce his debt. Can you just go into that a little bit? And obviously that was a big issue for him a couple of years ago, but now it seems like he's trying to get that under control.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was really kind of on the brink a few years ago because
Mhm.
he didn't have much cash on his balance sheet and he had enormous liabilities. Most notably, when he lost his civil fraud case, the judge imposed a $454 million penalty that was going to accrue at about 9% interest per year. So that's a
Oh,
big number for somebody like Trump to handle. When he left the White House, he only had about $100 million in cash. And although he had conjured up some more uh, between leaving the White House and when that penalty was imposed, he still didn't have enough to pay that alone, nor did he then have enough to do anything else after that. So he was really in a tight situation. But that being overturned is huge for him. And in the meantime, he also has come up with tons more cash. A lot of that is through World Liberty Financial. We now estimate that his cash pile is over $1 billion. But he's also knocked out some of his other troublesome loans. 40 Wall Street was in deep trouble, not generating big profits, and with a really, really nasty ground lease that was going to escalate in a handful of years that really depressed the value of that building. So he paid off that. That was $114 million. He had some old loans that were hanging around on his balance sheet, one from a mansion that he built, or excuse me, purchased in the 90s um, up in upstate New York, and then another one on another mansion that he bought across from Mar-a-Lago from his sister in 2018. He paid off both of those. So if you combine all that together, that's about $130 million of debt wiped off the balance sheet. Then you have the $500 million fraud ruling thrown out. Then you have all this new cash. I mean, he's really sitting pretty uh, from a from an underwriting standpoint right now. He has the cash to do whatever he wants to do. And if he needs more cash, he's got the sort of balance sheet that a lot of lenders would be willing to give him money.
I mean, it's been a fantastic year for him financially, right?
There's no
Between all
question. I
these things,
mean,
yeah.
virtually in every asset, up and down his balance sheet, on the debt side, on the assets. I mean, everything is going his way.
So I wanted to sort of get a little bit behind the scenes. Obviously, as we mentioned already a few times, you've been covering it for a long time. I know you've been physically to a lot of his properties over the years to try to, you know, get actual verified information sometimes because we know he's boasted about the size of his properties before and it hasn't been accurate. What are some of the key things that, and you've obviously written a book about his business before as well that I encourage everyone watching to read. What are some of the biggest takeaways you've had in how, I guess, difficult it has been to report on him and his finances and how that might have changed between the first administration when he was out of office and now?
Well, I think it takes a lot of time. He has a lot of assets, and there is a lot of misinformation. Much of it's spread by him, but also by other people, and that is sort of filtered around. So you have to look very carefully. But it's doable. I think that there is this misperception that we can't possibly understand the ways in which Trump is making money, or who's lending him money, or what is fortune actually consists of. And that's not true. Real estate, for its reputation of being such an opaque industry, actually is one of the most transparent industries that you can report on.
Right.
There are tons of documents available. He had large loans against a lot of these properties that spit off, massive amounts of information about bonds connected to those loans. He files for tax appeals on properties with local governments, and there's an enormous amount of information that's produced in that process. So you just sort of have to look for, okay, where are the data sources that are, official sources, and then compare those to everything else and make sure that you've got the right numbers. And then you just look at it. The way I've always looked at it is just it's one big math equation. What are the assets? What are they bringing in? How much are they worth? What are the liabilities? How much does he owe on them? And you just look at the numbers, and that if you focus everything on the numbers, it helps cut through a lot of the noise and make sure that you're not, sort of falling into just, the political winds or anything like that.
Right. I mean, on real estate, I remember a few years ago you taught me how to look at the mortgage-backed securities filings. There's so much information there on real estate.
It's unbelievable. I mean, can you imagine if you had another private company that had that level of detail about not just like the overarching business, but about specific individual parts of the business. I
Hmm.
mean, if you, it's super time consuming, but if you take the time, it's really possible to get an almost complete understanding of everything happening in this fortune.
Sure. And him being such a obviously a prominent public figure, even before he was president and then when he was away from the White House, how do you deal with the pressures of reporting on someone who is obviously such a prominent person and, has a lot of supporters and detractors and being specialized in reporting on him? How have you dealt with, the personal pressures, I guess, that come with that over the years?
Well, there's all sorts of different pressures, but ultimately, it comes from people caring about what you're reporting on, and that's what you want. You want to be doing the thing that people are, passionate about, that people have a
Right.
lot of opinions about. So that's all good. As I said, you look at it as a math equation, go from there, and there's a lot happening. You have to move, quickly, report as quickly as you can, but also make sure that you're breaking new information. And that's just a balance. How do you stay on the news and also make sure that you're, able to not just be repetitive of what other people are doing, but to uncover new information. So all sorts of pressures. But the bottom line is like, if you're covering something where there's no pressure, people probably aren't reading. So like
Very
it's
true.
as a
Very true.
journalist, it's not a bad thing to be in a pressure cooker.
Yeah, and impeccable fact checking and footnotes. I think any
Those are
reader of
helpful as
yours
well.
will
You,
know.
you have to be
Yeah.
very, very detailed. And one thing that I've learned covering him for so long is that the better notes that you take, uh, there's compounding returns on all of that. I mean, in year seven, you know much more. You can pull from much more. You don't have to say, "Oh, where did I pull that thing 5 years ago?" I mean, I can generally pretty quickly find exactly, what was the basis for every word that I've printed over time, and so that makes your reporting better as the years roll on.
So, lastly, I want to kind of ask you how you think Trump's fortune and how he's grown it in office, what kind of impact that might have on politics in general. I mean, we've obviously seen other billionaires, run for governor and win election to those offices, or serve in the cabinet, run for president. Do you think this is setting a precedent somehow, or do you see him as sort of more of a unique figure compared to other politicians and other wealthy people getting into politics?
Well, I think there are kind of two ways to approach that. The first is the question of, are billionaires just like good politicians? Like, are we going to see a lot more billionaire politicians? I'm sort of skeptical of that. I do
Mm-hmm.
think that Trump is a pretty unique figure. One of the clearest examples of that is that if you look at The Apprentice, they've tried to do reality shows with charismatic, wealthy people that have
Mm-hmm.
not done well. After Trump left The Apprentice, they tried to continue it with Arnold Schwarzenegger, one of the most charismatic people that the United States has seen in the last
And
50 years.
also a current billionaire and former politician too, right? So same kind of category, I
Exactly.
guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it didn't work. So I do think that Trump is a unique figure. I think that there are a lot of billionaires who see what he's done and are more curious about it. Could I translate this as he has done it? But I think that time will probably show that there isn't a huge appetite or ability for other billionaires to come in and sort of do what Trump has done. I think he's probably the greatest marketer in American history, and that is, you don't get that just by being worth a lot of money. He has a special talent for that. So that's one thing. Then you have sort of the actions in office and the ability to figure out ways to make money from politics. And I do think that that is precedent setting. Um, I think that future politicians will likely be less hesitant to uh, you know use the office to make money. And I think that the American public has shown that they're willing to accept some of that. And so I think that people will fear the political repercussions of it much less than they used to. So as we look, 20 years down the line, will there be a billionaire in office? Maybe not. Whoever is in office, will they be trying to make money while doing so? There's a good chance.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm excited to keep reading your work. I know you're also working on the rest of the Trump family and sort of how their fortune has been growing. But Dan, thanks so much for taking the time today and giving us this behind the scenes look into your work and tracking the president's finances.
Sure thing. Thanks, Giacomo.
You can find Dan's story and all the other stories we mentioned in today's episode in the video description notes, and keep following us for more coverage of billionaires.